Texas 1885. On a ranch stolen through forged paper, a young woman is about to be forced to sign her own marriage certificate to the very man who ruined her life. Three men pin Clara down against the mahogany desk. The pen trembles between her fingers, bent and forced into her grip. "Sign it," Silas Thorne hisses, his eyes cold as steel. "Or I'll have my men guide your hand for you, whether you like it or not." Before the tears can even fall, the heavy oak doors explode off their hinges. A figure stands framed in the doorway, swallowed by the raging dust storm behind him. A Winchester rifle braced hard against his shoulder, his gaze cold enough to cut steel. "She's coming with me," he says, voice flat and unshaken. One shot. The inkwell shatters. And in that single moment, Clara Hayes's entire life is torn onto a path no one could have predicted. Stay with us as we dive into the full story right now, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next breathless Western tale. The sun sat straight up over the Hayes ranch, and the heat had teeth. Clara Hayes worked the pitchfork through old straw, sweat cutting clean lines down her dusty face. Her hands had calluses now, thick ones, the kind a rancher's daughter shouldn't have to earn on land that was supposed to be hers. She heard the carriage before she saw it. Wheels creaking, leather straining, horses breathing hard against the heat. Gold trim caught the sun and threw it back like a slap. Beatrice stepped down first, parasol already open, gloves already spotless. Silas Thorne followed, unhurried, like a man who'd never once in his life needed to rush. "Clara, dear." Beatrice's voice carried that sugar-sweet edge Clara had learned to dread. "Put that down. We have matters to discuss." Clara set the pitchfork against the stall door. She wiped her palms on her apron and waited. "The ranch is finished," Beatrice said. "Bankrupt. Your father's debts have caught up to us at last." A pause, timed too well to be real grief. "But Mr. Thorne has offered a solution. You'll marry him by week's end." The words landed flat and hard. Clara's stomach dropped, but her face stayed still. She'd practiced that, years of practice. "This is my father's land," Clara said. "There's no debt. You forged it." Silas smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Careful now. I won't marry you," Clara said. "Not for a lie you built out of paper." That was when his hand came up. Fast, it cracked across her cheek and sent her stumbling into the stall door. Pain bloomed white behind her eyes. Dust kicked up around her boots. And then a voice, low and even, cut through the yard. "Didn't take you for a man who hits women." Every head turned. A rider sat atop a black roan at the edge of the property, reins loose in one hand, hat low over his eyes. He hadn't announced himself. He'd just arrived, the way weather does. Sudden and impossible to argue with. "This isn't your business, stranger," Silas said. "Wasn't planning on making it mine." The rider swung down off his horse, slow and deliberate. Up close he was big, broad through the shoulders, a scar cutting pale through one eyebrow. "Came for water. Nothing more." "Then get your water and ride on." The stranger didn't answer right away. He walked toward the well, boots quiet in the dirt, and set his canteen down on the barrel beside it. But he didn't fill it. He stood there a moment, looking at Clara's cheek, already reddening, already swelling at the edge of her jaw. Then he looked at Silas. Nobody moved for a long few seconds. Silas's men, three of them lounging near the carriage, straightened up without being told to. Beatrice's parasol tilted, forgotten in her hand. "Man puts his hand on a woman in front of witnesses," the stranger said. "Usually means he's got no other way to make her listen. That tells me plenty. You don't know who you're talking to. Don't much care." He stepped forward, and though his hand never went near the pistol on his hip, something in the way he moved made it clear he didn't need to. Silas took a half step back before he seemed to catch himself doing it. "This is Silas Thorne," Beatrice said quickly, like the name alone should end the conversation. "He owns half this county. Then he can afford to leave one girl alone." The stranger's eyes hadn't left Silas's face. "Touch her again, and it'll be the last thing that hand does." Silas's jaw worked, but no words came. He looked at his men, and none of them stepped forward either. Whatever they saw in the stranger's face, it was enough to keep their boots planted. "We're not finished here," Silas finally said to Clara, and then, stiffly, to the stranger, "Enjoy your water." He climbed back into the carriage. Beatrice followed, casting one last look at Clara, sharp and cold, before the door shut. The wheels ground back into motion, and the gilded carriage rolled off down the dusty road, shrinking smaller and smaller until the heat swallowed it whole. Clara realized she'd been holding her breath the whole time. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," the stranger agreed. "Didn't have to." He filled his canteen at last, unhurried, like the last 5 minutes hadn't happened at all. Man ought to do it anyway. She studied him. Dust on his coat, a rifle strapped across his saddle, a face that looked like it had seen more trouble than most men see in a lifetime. He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer his own. He just capped his canteen, turned back toward his horse, and paused. He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver dollar, setting it gently on top of the barrel. "For the water," he said. "You didn't need to pay." "I know." He swung back up into the saddle, easy as breathing, and looked down at her one more time. There was something in that look. Not pity, something closer to respect, the kind you don't hand out easy. "Take care of that jaw," he said. Then he turned the roan and rode off toward the horizon, dust rising soft behind him, until he was just a shape against the sun, and then nothing at all. Clara stood there a long moment, the silver dollar catching the light. Her cheek throbbed, her hands still shook from adrenaline, but something in her had shifted. Quiet and certain, like a door she hadn't known was locked, had just been given the smallest crack of light. She picked up the coin and went back to work. The house was quiet by midnight, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears. Clara lay still in her narrow bed until she heard Beatrice's door close down the hall, until the old floorboard stopped creaking under her stepmother's slippered feet. Then she counted to 200, slow the way she always did, and slipped out from under the quilt. She moved through the dark house without a candle. She knew every step that groaned and every one that didn't. 6 years of sneaking had taught her that much. The study door stuck a little at the bottom. She lifted it slightly on its hinges, easing it open just enough to slide through, then shut it behind her with the same care. Moonlight came through the window in a long silver stripe across the desk. That was enough light to work by. She knelt at the base of the bookshelf, pressed her fingers against the third panel from the floor, and popped it loose. Inside, wrapped in an old flour sack, sat her ledger, leather-bound, water-stained at the corners. The pages inside filled with her father's neat hand for the first third of the book, and her own cramped scrawl for the rest. She carried it to the desk and opened it to the most recent entry. March 14, Thorne recorded a lien against the Cordell property, filed with County Clerk Adams. No prior debt exists in father's records. Adams signed as witness, though he was in Austin that week per the newspaper. She dipped her pen and added a new line beneath it. April 2, Thorne proposes marriage as means to seize Hayes' land outright. Beatrice complicit. Stranger intervened. Unknown name. She stared at that last part longer than she meant to. Unknown name. She didn't know why that detail mattered enough to write down. But it did, so she left it. This ledger was the only thing in her life that still belonged to her. Everyone thought she spent her nights praying or crying into a pillow, the way a girl in her position was supposed to. Instead, she spent them here, turning herself from a victim into something closer to a witness. Every forged deed, every falsified debt, every name that showed up too many times where it didn't belong. She wrote it down. Someday, somebody would have to answer for all of it. She intended to be the one holding the proof when that day came. She closed the ledger and returned it to its hiding place, then slipped back through the house and out the kitchen door into the yard. The night air had cooled some, though not much. She crossed the pasture with a plate balanced in one hand, leftover stew she'd scraped from the pot before Beatrice's maid could throw it out. She'd noticed the stranger's camp earlier that evening, a thin ribbon of smoke rising past the tree line at the edge of the property, a mile out where Hayes' land gave way to open range. She found him seated near a low fire, his rifle across his knees, not asleep despite the hour. You always creep up on a man in the dark, he asked without turning. You always hear people before they know you've heard them. That got the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. He looked up at her then, taking in the plate in her hands. Didn't figure I'd get supper delivered. Didn't figure you for a man who talks much either. She held out the plate. It's not much, stew's a day old. Better than what I've had most nights. He took it, and their fingers brushed for half a second before she pulled back. She sat down on a flat rock a few feet from the fire. Close enough to talk, far enough to keep some distance between them. It felt strange, sitting out here past midnight with a stranger. It also felt like the first honest conversation she'd had in longer than she could remember. You never told me your name, she said. Wyatt Sterling. Clara Hayes. I know, heard your stepmother use it plenty loud this afternoon. Clara looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. You didn't have to step in today. Most men would have kept writing. Most men aren't worth much then. He ate a spoonful of stew before he spoke again. You always let him talk to you that way. I don't have much choice. Not since my father died. How'd he die? The question came plain. No softness dressing it up, but something about the directness made it easier to answer than if he'd tiptoed around it. Fell from his horse. That's what the doctor said. Broke his neck on a trail he'd ridden 1,000 times before, on a horse that never once threw him in 15 years. She swallowed. Beatrice married him 2 years before that. I think she married him because she already knew what she planned to do with what he had. Wyatt didn't say anything to that. He just watched the fire for a long moment, his jaw tight. You think she had something to do with it, he said finally. Not a question. I don't have proof. Not for that. For the rest of it. I do, she hesitated, then decided the dark and the fire and the stranger's steady quiet made this a night for truth-telling. I've been keeping a record. Every forged paper, every false debt Thorns used to swallow up land around here. My father's, and others too. Small ranches, tribal allotments along the river. All of it stolen the same way. On paper that looks legal enough if nobody looks too close. Wyatt's eyes came up sharp at that. How long you been keeping this record? Since my father died. 2 years now. He was quiet again. Longer this time, and Clara found herself watching his face in the firelight, trying to read what moved behind it. There was something old and worn about him, beyond just years. A man who'd seen his share of loss and come out the other side, changed by it. You're not what I expected, he said eventually. What did you expect? Girl beaten down by a man like Thorne. Figured you'd be too scared to breathe wrong, let alone keep a ledger against him. I am scared. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Every single day. But scared doesn't mean stupid. And it doesn't mean I have to sit still and let it happen to me. He studied her a moment longer, and something shifted in his expression. Some wall coming down just a fraction. Come here, he said, and when she hesitated, he added, your jaw. Let me look at it. She moved closer, and he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth, wetting it from his canteen before pressing it, gentle, against the bruise already darkening along her cheekbone. His hand was rough, calloused from work and weather, but his touch was careful. More careful than she expected from a man built the way he was. Sit still, he said, though she hadn't moved. Maybe the words were more for himself than her. It doesn't hurt as much as it looks like it should. Adrenaline does that. Wears off later. You'll feel it tomorrow. He held the cloth in place a moment longer, then pulled it back to study the bruise in the low light. You get hit before. Not just today. It wasn't a question, and she didn't bother pretending otherwise. A few times. Beatrice, mostly. Thorne's men once, when I tried to stop them from moving cattle that weren't theirs. And you kept your head down through all of it. I had to. Fighting back only made it worse, and I still had the ledger to protect. Couldn't risk losing it, or losing the chance to finish what I started. Wyatt set the cloth aside and looked at her steady. The kind of look that didn't blink away from hard truths. Endurance keeps you breathing. Clara, he said, but accepting the whip makes you the one holding it. There's a difference between surviving something and letting it become who you are. She turned that over in her mind, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere true. I don't know how to do anything else. Not yet. Then maybe it's time you learned. They sat in silence after that. the fire crackling low, the stars spread wide and cold overhead. Clara found herself in no hurry to leave, and something in Wyatt's posture told her he wasn't in a hurry for her to go, either. "Why'd you really stop today?" she asked. "You could have just filled your canteen and ridden on. Wasn't your fight?" Wyatt was quiet a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick before he answered. "Because I've seen a man raise his hand to a woman before and told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself the same thing more than once. I'm done telling myself that." There was history in those words, old grief buried under them. But he didn't offer more, and Clara didn't push. She recognized the shape of a wound even when she couldn't see it directly. She had enough of her own to know how they worked. "I should get back," she said eventually, rising to her feet. "Before anyone notices I'm gone." "Same time tomorrow?" Wyatt asked, and there was something almost hopeful buried under the flat delivery. "If you're still here, I'll be here." He looked at her, steady and certain, long as thorns circling this land. "I've got reason to stay close." She nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and started back across the dark pasture toward the house. Halfway there, she looked back once. Wyatt hadn't moved, still seated by the fire, watching her go the way a man watches something he intends to keep safe. She didn't know yet what he meant to her, or what she meant to him, but she knew the ledger felt lighter somehow, now that someone else knew it existed. Now that someone else believed her. That night, for the first time in 2 years, she slept without dreaming of her father's broken neck. The wind picked up 2 days later, a low moan across the plains that farmers in Red Creek knew well enough to fear. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the color of an old bruise, yellow-brown and swollen, and the air carried grit that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. "Habub's coming," old Ruiz said from the porch of the general store, watching the wall of dust building on the horizon. "Best get indoors." Clara watched it too from the kitchen window, feeling something uneasy settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd learned to trust that feeling. It rarely lied to her. By 4 in the afternoon, the storm hit Red Creek with the force of a slammed door. Wind screamed through the eaves of the house, rattling windows in their frames, driving fine dust through every crack and seam. Clara moved through the house, securing shutters, and that was when she heard the carriage. Nobody in their right mind traveled in a storm like this. Nobody except a man who wanted the storm as cover. Silas Thorne came through the front door without knocking, 3 armed men behind him, and behind them, wind-whipped and clutching his hat, a preacher Clara had never seen before. Beatrice appeared from the parlor, already dressed as if for a celebration, her face lit with an eagerness that turned Clara's stomach. "We've waited long enough," Silas said, raising his voice over the storm howling outside. To Clara, "The wedding happens today. I already told you my answer." "Your answer doesn't matter anymore." Silas nodded to his men, and 2 of them moved toward her before she could react. Rough hands closed around her arms, dragging her toward the parlor. "Let go of me." She twisted against their grip, but they were too strong, hauling her toward the heavy mahogany desk where a marriage certificate already sat waiting, ink pot beside it, pen laid out neat as an invitation to her own funeral. Beatrice moved to the heavy front doors and threw the iron bolt across them, sealing the house against the storm and against any hope of Clara running. "You'll thank me one day," Beatrice said, not even bothering to look at her. "A girl like you doesn't get many chances at a life like this." "You mean a life like the one you built on my father's grave." Beatrice's face went cold at that, but she said nothing. Only watched as the 2 men forced Clara down into the chair before the desk, one holding her shoulders while the other pried her fingers open and forced the pen between them. "Sign it," Silas said, "or I'll have my men hold your hand steady while the preacher marries us anyway. The paper's a formality. The outcome's the same either way." Clara's heart pounded against her ribs, and she fought against the hands pinning her. But her strength wasn't enough against 2 grown men. The pen scraped against the paper as they forced her hand down toward the line marked with an X. That was when the front doors exploded inward. Wind tore through the parlor first, a wall of dust and howling air that snuffed the oil lamps in an instant, plunging the room into near darkness, broken only by flashes of lightning through the open doorway. Every head in the room turned. Wyatt Sterling stood in the wreckage of the doorframe, rain and dust streaking his coat. A Winchester rifle braced hard against his shoulder, already sighted. "Let her go," he said, voice flat and carrying easy over the storm. Silas's men reached for their sidearms, but Wyatt fired first. The shot cracked through the room, shattering the ink pot into black shards across the desk, ruining the marriage certificate beneath a spray of ink that looked, in the flickering lightning, almost like blood. "Next one goes through a man, not an ink pot," Wyatt said, working the lever with practiced ease, chambering another round. Anybody care to test that? Nobody moved. The two men holding Clara let go of her arms, stepping back with hands raised. Silas stood frozen by the desk, his face twisted somewhere between fury and fear. "You've got no right," Silas said. "This is a private matter. Forcing a woman's hand to a marriage certificate against her ain't private. It's a crime." Wyatt's eyes swept the room once, cataloging every man, every weapon, every angle. "Clara, come here." Clara didn't hesitate. She rose from the chair and crossed the room to him, and Wyatt shifted his stance to put himself between her and Silas's men without ever taking the rifle off target. "You'll regret this," Silas said, backing toward the far wall as the preacher scrambled for the door Wyatt had already destroyed. "This isn't finished." "Reckon you're right about that," Wyatt said, "but it's finished for tonight." He backed toward the doorway, keeping Clara close behind him, the rifle never wavering from Silas and his men. The storm raged around them, wind screaming through the broken door, dust and rain mixing into a stinging blur. "You come after her," Wyatt said, "and I promise you, the next bullet won't hit an inkpot." Then he turned, grabbed Clara's hand, and they ran. The horses waited just past the porch. Wyatt's black roan and a second horse he'd apparently brought for exactly this purpose. He swung her up onto the second horse before mounting his own, and they rode hard into the storm, the ranch house shrinking behind them into a smear of lantern light and chaos. The wind fought them every step, dust stinging exposed skin, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Clara clung to the reins with white knuckles, trusting the horse to find footing she couldn't see, trusting Wyatt riding just ahead of her to lead them somewhere safe. They rode for what felt like an hour before the terrain changed beneath the horses' hooves, the ground rising and narrowing, walls of red rock closing in on either side, blocking some of the wind's worst fury. Wyatt slowed his horse to a walk, guiding them deeper into what Clara realized was a canyon, a maze of stone corridors carved by centuries of flash floods. "Where are we?" she called over the wind, still fierce, but muffled some by the canyon walls. "Slot Canyons, west of Red Creek. Thorne's men won't follow easy in this dark, and even less easy come morning if the storm keeps up." Wyatt glanced back at her, dust caked across his face, rain plastering his hair down beneath his hat. "You all right?" "I don't know yet," he nodded, understanding more in that than most men would have. They rode on until the canyon narrowed enough to force them to dismount, leading the horses on foot through a passage barely wide enough for two people abreast. That was when Clara's legs gave out. She hadn't realized how much the adrenaline had been holding her upright until it started to drain away, replaced by a bone-deep cold and a trembling that started in her hands and spread through her whole body. Her knees buckled, and Wyatt caught her before she hit the ground. "Clara, hey, look at me." Her teeth had started to chatter, and her vision swam at the edges, the shock finally catching up with everything her body had been through. "I'm cold," she managed. "I'm so cold." "I know, shock does that. Come on, there's shelter up ahead." He half carried her the rest of the way, finding a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall, deep enough to block the worst of the wind and rain. He got the horses settled near the entrance, then turned his attention to Clara, who sat shivering against the rock wall, arms wrapped tight around herself. "We need to get you warm," he said, already shrugging out of his heavy canvas duster. The duster smelled like leather, gun oil, and rain, and Wyatt draped it over Clara's shoulders before sitting down beside her, close enough that their sides pressed together in the narrow space. "This isn't enough," he said, watching her shiver even through the thick canvas. "Body heat works faster." Clara looked up at him, understanding what he meant, and something in her chest tightened at the practicality of it, the way he stated it plain. No suggestion buried underneath, just fact. "All right," she said. He shifted, pulling her carefully against his chest, wrapping one arm around her while she huddled into the warmth radiating off him. It felt strange at first, the closeness of a man she'd known only a handful of days. But the cold made the strangeness fade fast, replaced by simple gratitude for the heat seeping into her frozen limbs. They sat like that a long while, the storm raging outside the cave mouth, wind howling through the canyon like something alive. Slowly, the trembling in Clara's body eased. "Thank you," she murmured against his shoulder. "For today, for all of it. Didn't do anything you wouldn't have found a way out of eventually." "I don't know about that. Those men were stronger than me. I couldn't stop them. You didn't need to stop them. You just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive." He was quiet a moment, then added, "That's not weakness, Clara. Man who thinks a woman fighting back alone against 3 armed men and win is asking for something that don't happen outside of dime novels." She laughed, soft and surprised. The first real laugh she'd managed in longer than she could remember. "I didn't take you for a man who reads dime novels. I don't. Read one once. On a train ride to El Paso. Whole thing was nonsense, front to back." They sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to the storm slowly losing its fury outside. Clara found herself studying the scar through Wyatt's eyebrow in the dim light filtering through the cave mouth, the way it pulled slightly when he frowned. "How'd you get that scar?" she asked. Wyatt's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Same reason I stopped for you today," he said finally. "I had a sister once, younger than me by 6 years. Her name was Sarah. Had land baron out in the Nueces Valley. Name of Callahan. Forced her family off their ranch. Same way Thorne's doing to folks around here. Forged papers, false debts, the whole rotten business. I was off running with the Rangers at the time, chasing outlaws 2 counties over, thinking I was doing important work." His voice had gone rough. "Older somehow. By the time I got word and made it home, Sarah was already gone. Took her own life rather than marry the man Callahan had picked out for her." Clara's breath caught. "Wyatt, I'm so sorry. I told myself for years it wasn't my fault. Told myself I couldn't have known. Couldn't have stopped it, even if I had." He looked down at her, something raw and honest in his expression. "But when I saw Thorne raise his hand to you that day, all I could see was Sarah's face. I couldn't ride past it again. Not this time." Clara reached up, resting her hand against his jaw, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "You're not responsible for what happened to your sister. Maybe not. But I'm responsible for what happens next. For you. For this valley. For every family Thorne's trying to swallow up the same way Callahan did back home." His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. Clara, I want you to understand that." "Then why?" "Because you're the first thing in a long while that's made me feel like fighting for something instead of just against something." His eyes held hers steady in the dim light. "You're not just a rescue to me. You never were. Even that first day." Something shifted between them in that moment, quiet and certain. The kind of understanding that didn't need more words to make it real. Clara leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath layers of damp cotton. "I have a confession, too," she said after a while. "Yeah? That first night I brought you stew. I told myself it was just gratitude. But I think some part of me already knew I wanted an excuse to see you again." Wyatt's arm tightened around her, just slightly, and she felt him press a kiss against the top of her head, gentle and undemanding. "Get some sleep," he said. "Storm will pass by morning, and we've got a long ride ahead figuring out what comes next. What does come next, don't rightly know yet. But whatever it is, we're facing it together now." Thorne made sure of that the moment he decided your family's land was his for the taking. Clara closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking the last of her adrenaline. Safe in the shelter of the cave and the warmth of a man who'd chosen, twice now, to stand between her and everything trying to break her. Outside, the storm began to ease, wind softening to a low murmur against the canyon walls. The worst of the night's violence spending itself against the ancient red rock. By morning, the sky would clear to a hard, bright blue, the kind that came after every storm in this country. As if the land itself insisted on starting fresh, no matter what damage the night before had done. Clara drifted toward sleep, thinking of the ledgers still tucked in her satchel, of the fight still ahead of them, and of the steady warmth of the man holding her through the last hours of the storm. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel like she was facing the fight alone. Morning broke slow over the canyon, the sky brightening from black to gray to a pale, washed-out blue that looked almost apologetic after the fury of the night before. Clara woke stiff and disoriented, the smell of wet leather and campfire smoke thick in her nose. It took her a moment to remember where she was and why Wyatt Sterling's arm was still wrapped around her shoulders. He was already awake. She could tell by his breathing, too even, and controlled to belong to a sleeping man. "Morning," he said, voice rough with the early hour. "Morning." She sat up slowly, testing her limbs, surprised to find the trembling from the night before had passed. "How long have you been up?" "Hour or so. Wanted to make sure the storm had really passed before I woke you." Clara pushed the canvas duster off her shoulders and handed it back to him, though the cold air outside the cave mouth made her miss its warmth almost immediately. Wyatt shrugged it back on and stood, moving to the mouth of the cave to check on the horses, both of which had weathered the night tied to a stunted juniper growing sideways out of the rock. Clara reached for her satchel, the one she'd managed to grab in the chaos of the night before, and pulled out the ledger. The leather cover had taken some water damage along one edge, but the pages inside were mostly dry, the ink holding despite everything. "I should show you this properly," she said. "Last night wasn't the time." Wyatt came back and sat beside her, and she opened the ledger to the first page, the one written in her father's careful hand. "My father started keeping records the year before he died. He'd noticed things weren't adding up. Deeds filed for land he'd never sold, liens against ranches that had never carried debt. He didn't understand it fully himself, not before he died, but he wrote down everything he found strange." She turned the pages slowly, showing Wyatt entry after entry. Dates, names, filed documents. Discrepancies between what the county records claimed and what the ranchers themselves swore to be true. "After he died, I kept it going. I didn't know what else to do with my time. Honestly, Beatrice had me working like a hired hand, and at night, this was the only thing that made me feel like I still had some say in what happened to me." Wyatt studied the pages with the focus of a man reading terrain before a fight, looking for the places where the ground might give way beneath him. "This is thorough," he said, "more thorough than anything a county sheriff's put together. And I'd bet money most of them have been paid to look elsewhere. Anyway, that's what I figured, too. Thorne's got Clerk Adams in his pocket. Probably the sheriff as well, though I've never been able to prove that part." Wyatt turned to a page near the middle, one detailing a series of land transfers from 3 years back, and went very still. "What is it?" Clara asked. "This lawyer here handled the paperwork on these transfers." He pointed to a name written in her careful script. "Elias Cobb, you know him." "I know him." Wyatt's voice had gone flat, controlled in a way that told Clara more than his words did. "He's the same lawyer who drew up the false debt against my family's ranch back in the Nueces Valley. Same man who forged the documents that took my sister's home out from under her." Clara's breath caught. "Are you certain?" "Certain as I am of my own name. Man's got a habit of dating his documents with a particular flourish under the year. I'd know that mark anywhere. Spent enough nights staring at a copy of it, trying to figure out how a man sleeps at night after doing what he does." Clara reached out and covered his hand with hers, feeling the tension coiled there. "He's still working for Thorne," she said, "still in the county, still drawing up the same kind of paper. Then he's still doing the same damage. Just to different families now. Wyatt looked up from the ledger, and something had shifted in his expression. Some line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. This isn't just about getting you clear of Thorn anymore. Clara, this is the same rot, spreading the same way, hurting the same kind of people. Your father, my sister, everybody Thorn swallowed up since. Then we stop it, together. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, and Clara watched something settle behind his eyes. Some decision reached that she suspected had been building since the moment he'd stepped between her and Silas in the yard 3 days before. You understand what that means, he said. Running isn't enough anymore. Hiding in canyons isn't enough. We go after this properly. It means going back toward the fire, not away from it. I've spent 2 years hiding in plain sight, writing down every crime I couldn't stop, waiting for a day I could actually do something with what I know. Clara closed the ledger and held it against her chest. I'm done waiting, Wyatt nodded slowly. And for the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw something close to admiration in the way he looked at her. Not the careful, assessing look he'd given her that first day in the yard. Something warmer. You kept records like this for 2 years, working under a woman who beats you and a man who tried to force you to the altar. He shook his head slightly. I figured you for brave the day I saw you talk back to Thorn with a bruise already forming on your face. I didn't figure you for a tactician. I had to become one. Wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. Necessity builds some hard skills. He took the ledger from her gently, turning back to an earlier page, studying the entries with new interest. This page here, the water rights filed against the Cordell property. You said Adams signed as witness, though he was in Austin. According to the newspaper archive at the county library. Yes, I checked the dates against the filing 3 times to be sure before I wrote it down. That's the kind of detail that hangs a man in front of a federal judge, not just a county one. Falsifying a witness signature on a land filing. That's fraud, and fraud that crosses county interest touches federal law. Wyatt looked up at her, something calculating now in his expression. You know more about how this works than most lawyers I've dealt with. I read everything my father left behind about land law after he died. Figured if Thorn was going to try and take what belonged to us through paper, I ought to understand the paper better than he did. Then you understand something I don't. I know how to fight men with guns. Never had much cause to fight men with paper before. Then we make a good pair, Clara said. You handle what comes at us with guns. I'll handle what comes at us with ink. Wyatt almost smiled at that, the expression sitting strange and unfamiliar on a face that seemed built for solemnity. Partners, then, he said. Partners. They spent the rest of the morning going through the ledger page by page, Wyatt asking questions that sharpened Clara's own understanding of what she'd collected, pointing out patterns she hadn't fully connected herself. By midday, they'd built something between them that went beyond gratitude or attraction, a working respect built on the recognition that each of them carried a piece the other lacked. We can't go back to the ranch, Clara said eventually, as they packed up what little they'd carried into the canyon. Not directly. Beatrice and Thorn will have men watching the roads. Agreed. We need somewhere to regroup. Somewhere Thorn's reach doesn't extend as easy. There's a settlement west of here, past the dry wash, indigenous families, mostly Comanche and some Kiowa, along with a handful of ranchers. Thorns already run off their own land. My father used to trade with them before he died, wrote about it some in his old journals. Clara hesitated. I don't know if they'd welcome a stranger, especially one who used to wear a ranger's badge. Wyatt's jaw tightened at that. Rangers haven't always dealt fair with the tribes out here. I won't pretend otherwise, but you're not wearing that badge now. No, I gave it up 2 years back. After Sarah died, couldn't stomach serving under men who looked the other way when it came to land theft, same as what happened to my own family, so long as the ones doing the stealing wore the right kind of collar and paid the right kind of bribe. Clara studied him, understanding a little more now about the shape of the man riding beside her. Then maybe that's exactly the kind of stranger they'd welcome, she said. One who understands what it costs to have your home stolen out from under you by men who think paper makes it legal. Wyatt considered that as he checked the cinch on his saddle, then nodded once, decisive. Worth the ride to find out. They mounted up and rode west, the sun climbing higher and burning off the last of the storm's chill. The canyon opening slowly into wider country, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. Clara kept the ledger tucked close against her body, somewhere in the miles between the canyon and whatever waited for them at the settlement. The fear that had gripped her for 2 years began, slowly to loosen its hold. She wasn't running anymore. She was moving toward something. And for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't moving toward it alone. They reached the settlement 2 days later, tucked into a fold of land along a spring-fed creek that ran clear even in the dry season. A resource valuable enough that Clara understood immediately why Thorne hadn't yet found a way to claim it. The families there received them with caution at first, several men stepping forward with rifles, half-raised, until an older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, recognized Clara's face. "Hey," the woman said, "your father traded fair with us for years. You've got his eyes. I remember you," Clara said, though the memory was faint, buried under years of grief. "You came to the ranch once when I was a girl. Brought my father woven blankets in exchange for cattle." "Nasha," the woman said, "I remember you too. Quiet child, always watching everything." Her eyes moved to Wyatt, assessing him with the same directness she'd used on Clara. "This one's a ranger," was Wyatt said. "Not anymore. Rangers don't usually stop being rangers. It's more than a badge to most who wear it. Then I'm not most men. I lost my sister to the same kind of theft your people have lost land to. I don't serve under men who let that happen and call it the law." Nasha studied him a long moment, and Clara held her breath, uncertain which way the woman's judgment would fall. Finally, Nasha nodded. "Slow. We've got room for 2 more, so long as you understand you're guests here, not conquerors. This is not your land to claim, even in refuge," Wyatt said, fully. They were given a small shelter near the edge of the settlement, close enough to the community to feel welcomed, far enough to give them privacy. Over the following days, Clara watched Wyatt settle into the rhythm of the place with a humility that surprised her, helping repair fences, hauling water, never presuming more welcome than what was offered. It was on the 4th evening that he found her sitting outside their shelter, cleaning the old Colt revolver she'd carried since fleeing the ranch, her movements clumsy and uncertain. "You don't know how to use that," he said, settling down beside her. "I know how to hold it. That's about the extent of my education. That's dangerous. A gun you can't use right is more likely to get you hurt than help you. Then teach me." Wyatt studied her for a moment, weighing something behind his eyes. "Thorne's bounty hunters are going to come looking eventually. Man like that doesn't let a debt this large go unanswered. And by now he knows exactly what you took with you." He nodded toward the revolver. "You're right that you need to know how to defend yourself. Come on." He led her out past the edge of the settlement, to a stretch of open ground where a row of tin cans sat balanced along a fallen log. Clearly a spot the settlement's own children practiced their aim. "First thing," Wyatt said, taking the revolver from her hands and checking the cylinder. "This isn't about proving anything. It's not about anger, and it's not about revenge. A gun ain't for taking what isn't yours. It's for making sure no man ever decides you're worth again." Clara turned that over in her mind, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep. "I've spent 2 years having men decide things for me," she said. "My worth, my future, what I owed, and to who. Then let's make sure that stops today." He handed the revolver back to her, positioning himself behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cooling evening air. "Grip it like this, not too tight, not too loose. You want control, not a stranglehold." His hands came around hers, adjusting her fingers along the grip, and Clara found herself acutely aware of the calluses on his palms, rough from years of rope and rifle and reins, pressed against the softer skin of her own hands. "Now raise it slow, both eyes open, not one squeezed shut like they do in those dime novels." She raised the revolver, arm trembling slightly under the unfamiliar weight, and Wyatt's hands steadied hers without taking control away entirely, guiding rather than commanding. Breathe out slow as you squeeze the trigger. Don't yank it. Squeeze. The gun fired with a crack that made her flinch, despite the warning. The recoil jolting up her arm harder than she'd expected. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust a full 3 feet from the nearest can. That's all right, Wyatt said, voice steady against her ear. Nobody hits anything their first shot. Try again. They worked through the fading light, shot after shot. Wyatt's patience never wavering, even as Clara's shoulder began to ache from the unfamiliar recoil. Slowly her aim began to improve, the wild misses narrowing into shots that clipped the edges of the cans. Then finally, as full dark began to settle in, a shot that sent one of the cans spinning off the log entirely. There it is, Wyatt said, something like pride coloring his voice. See how that felt? Like I finally hit something instead of everything hitting me. That's the whole point. He stepped back, letting her stand on her own, though the warmth of where he'd been pressed against her back lingered a moment longer than the temperature alone could account for. You've got good instincts. Steady hands. Once you stop overthinking the recoil. I had a good teacher, had a good student. Most folks I've tried to teach get frustrated after the second miss and give up trying to learn proper form. You just adjusted and kept going. Clara lowered the revolver, turning to look at him in the dim light, the last traces of sunset painting the sky behind him in deep orange and purple. I don't have the luxury of giving up, she said, not with what's coming. No, Wyatt agreed. None of us do. They stood there a moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them named directly. The memory of his hands over hers, still fresh, still warm. Wyatt, Clara said, thank you, not just for teaching me to shoot, for treating me like I'm capable of learning it in the first place. You are capable, been capable this whole time. Just needed someone willing to see it instead of deciding for you what you could and couldn't handle. Not many men would say that. Not many men have watched a woman they respect get treated like she's incapable of protecting herself, when she's smarter and steadier than most men I've served alongside. His voice had gone quiet, more honest than his usual careful measure. I don't intend to be counted among those men. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest at that, distinct from the exhaustion in her arms or the ache in her shoulder from the day's practice. Should head back, she said, though she made no move to do so. Nasha will worry if we're out past dark. Probably right. Still, Wyatt didn't move either, and for a long moment, they simply stood there together in the deepening dark, the tin cans scattered around them, the smell of gunpowder still sharp in the cooling air. I keep thinking about what you said, Clara said eventually, about enduring, not being the same as fighting back. What about it? I think I understand it better now than I did that first night. Enduring is what I did for 2 years, keeping my head down, writing in secret, waiting for someone else to fix what was broken. She looked down at the revolver still in her hand. This feels like the first time I've actually fought instead of just survived. Feels different, doesn't it? Having some say in what happens to you. Feels like breathing after holding my breath a long time. Wyatt reached out, tucking a strand of hair that had come loose behind her ear, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. You're going to need that feeling, he said, because what's coming next isn't going to be easy. Thorne's not a man who loses gracefully. And once he realizes, you've got proof enough to hang him and his lawyer, both. He's going to come at us with everything he's got. I know you scared, terrified, Clara admitted, but not the same kind of scared I used to be. Not the scared that makes me want to hide. The kind that makes me want to be ready. Wyatt studied her a long moment, something warm and certain settling into his expression. Then, let's get you ready, he said, starting tomorrow. We work on your aim under pressure, moving targets, low light, the kind of conditions you're likely to face if Thorne's men catch up to us. And after that, we take everything in that ledger, and we make sure it lands somewhere Thorne can't buy his way out of. They walked back toward the settlement together in the dark, close enough that their shoulders brushed with each step, neither of them moving away from the contact. Clara thought about her father, about the 2 years of grief and fear that had brought her to this exact point, standing beside a man who saw her not as a victim to be rescued, but as an equal to be trusted. She thought, too, about how frightened she'd once been of what came next. That fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had changed shape, transformed from something that kept her small and quiet into something that sharpened her focus, steadied her aim, and reminded her exactly what she was fighting for. The bounty hunters found them 6 days later, at a shallow river, crossing 2 miles east of the settlement. Clara had ridden out with Wyatt to check a trap line near the water, a small task meant to help provide for the community that had taken them in. When the first shot cracked across the water and sent her horse rearing in panic. "Down," Wyatt shouted, already pulling his rifle from its scabbard as he swung off his own mount. Clara slid off her horse and hit the ground hard, scrambling for the cover of a fallen cottonwood along the bank, as a second shot kicked up dirt inches from where she'd been standing moments before. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but beneath the fear, something steadier had taken hold. The muscle memory of 6 days spent practicing exactly this kind of scenario. "How many?" she called to Wyatt, who'd taken position behind a boulder a few yards away. "Counted 4 so far. Could be more in the brush." He fired a shot toward the far bank, and a man's shout of pain answered, followed by a scramble of movement in the mesquite thicket across the water. "Thorne's paying good money for whoever brings you back, dead or alive, from the sound of that offer." Clara drew the revolver Wyatt had spent the past week teaching her to use, her hand steadier than she expected given the circumstances. She peered around the edge of the cottonwood, spotting movement in the brush across the river, and fired once, missing wide but forcing the shooter back under cover. "Good," Wyatt called. "Keep them pinned. I'm going to work around." Wyatt. But he was already moving, low and fast along the riverbank, using the terrain the way a man does who's spent years learning how ground could save or cost a life. Clara kept firing toward the brush, forcing the bounty hunters to keep their heads down, buying Wyatt the seconds he needed to circle wide toward their flank. The exchange of gunfire seemed to stretch endlessly, the crack of shots echoing off the canyon walls upstream, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the humid air along the water. Clara's hands had started to shake, but she forced herself to keep her aim steady, remembering everything Wyatt had taught her about breathing, about squeezing rather than yanking the trigger, about treating fear as something to work through rather than something to be paralyzed by. A shout went up from across the river, and then the crack of Wyatt's rifle, followed by a heavy splash as one of the bounty hunters went down into the shallows. 3 left, Wyatt called Clara. "Stay down." But even as he said it, Clara saw movement to her left, a 5th man she hadn't accounted for, creeping along the bank toward Wyatt's exposed flank. She didn't think. She raised the revolver, sighted down the barrel the way Wyatt had taught her, breathed out slow, and squeezed. The shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways into the mud, his own rifle discharging harmlessly into the dirt as he fell. "Wyatt, behind you," he spun at her warning, finishing the job with a shot that dropped the man for good. And Clara felt something twist in her stomach at the sight of it, the reality of what they'd just done settling in, despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. That was when the bullet caught Wyatt in the shoulder. She saw it happen almost in slow motion, the way his body jerked sideways, the surprise and pain flashing across his face before he collapsed into the mud along the bank, his rifle falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Wyatt panic hit her hard, a wave of fear, more intense than anything she'd felt since the night Thorne's men had dragged her toward that mahogany desk. But beneath the panic, something else took hold, the training of the past 6 days asserting itself even as her heart screamed to run to him. She grabbed his fallen rifle, working the lever with hands that shook but didn't fumble, and sighted toward the 2 remaining bounty hunters, still crouched in the brush across the water. "You want her," she shouted. "You're going to have to come through me." She fired and fired again, the Winchesters Kick harder than the revolvers, but manageable. Her shots finding enough of their mark to force the two remaining men back deeper into cover. One of them broke, scrambling backward through the brush toward where their horses waited, clearly deciding the bounty wasn't worth what it was costing them. The second man hesitated a moment too long. Clara's next shot caught him in the leg, dropping him into the shallow water, and he didn't rise again, just lay there groaning as the current tugged weakly at his clothes. Silence fell over the crossing, broken only by the rush of water and the ragged sound of Wyatt's breathing behind her. Clara dropped the rifle and scrambled to his side, pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. "Stay with me," she said, voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound steady. "Wyatt, look at me. Stay awake." "I'm awake," he managed, though his voice had gone thin and strained. "Just hurts like hell is all. I need to get you somewhere safe. I need to stop this bleeding first." She pulled her shawl free and pressed it hard against the wound, and Wyatt hissed through his teeth at the pressure, but didn't pull away. "There's a settlement," he said, "back the way we came. Nash's people. They've got a healer." "I know. I remember the way." Clara worked quickly, binding the makeshift bandage as tight as she dared, her hands steadier now that she had a task in front of her. Something concrete to focus on beyond the fear clawing at the edges of her mind. "Can you ride?" "Don't reckon I've got much choice." She helped him to his feet, his weight heavy against her as they made their way to his horse, and with considerable effort, managed to get him mounted, though his face had gone pale and sweat beaded thick along his hairline. "Hold on to the horn," she said. "I'll lead the horse. Stay conscious." "All right. Talk to me if you need to. Just don't close your eyes." "Bossy," Wyatt murmured, something almost like humor threading through the pain in his voice. "Didn't figure my shooting student would turn into my nursemaid inside a week. Didn't figure I'd have to." Clara shot back, though relief flooded through her at the fact that he could still manage words at all. "Now hush and hold on." She mounted her own horse and took the lead rope of his, guiding both animals at a careful pace back toward the settlement, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain for any sign of the fleeing bounty hunter returning with reinforcements. The ride felt endless, every mile stretching longer than it had any right to, Wyatt's breathing growing more labored beside her, despite his efforts to stay steady. "Almost there," she said, more for her own reassurance than his, as the familiar fold of land along the creek came into view. "Almost there, Wyatt. Stay with me." Nasha met them at the edge of the settlement, her sharp eyes taking in the situation immediately, shouting orders to two younger men who came running to help ease Wyatt down from his horse. "Bring him to my shelter," Nasha said. "I'll need hot water, clean cloth, and the yarrow from my stores." Clara followed close behind as they carried Wyatt into Nasha's shelter, laying him carefully on a woven mat while the old woman began cutting away his shirt to examine the wound properly. "Bullets still in there," Nasha said, probing gently at the wound while Wyatt gritted his teeth against the pain. "I can get it out, but it won't be pleasant." "Do it," Wyatt said through clenched teeth. "Whatever needs doing." Clara knelt beside him, taking his good hand in both of hers, and he gripped it tight as Nasha worked. His face contorting with pain, he refused to voice beyond ragged breathing and the occasional low groan. "You're doing fine," Clara murmured, though she wasn't entirely certain whether she meant the words for him or for herself. "You're doing just fine." It took the better part of an hour, Nasha's weathered hands steady and sure despite the delicate work, before she finally extracted the bullet and set to work, cleaning and dressing the wound properly. Wyatt had gone pale and quiet by the time she finished, exhaustion and blood loss finally pulling him under into something closer to sleep than consciousness. "He'll live," Nasha said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "Wound's clean now, and he's strong, but he'll need rest, and he won't be riding or shooting any time soon." "Thank you," Clara said, relief, nearly buckling her knees where she knelt beside him. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me yet." Nasha studied her carefully. "The men who did this, they'll be back." and likely with more than 5 guns next time. Whatever it is you two are fighting, it's not finished. Clara looked down at Wyatt's sleeping face, at the bandage wrapped tight around his shoulder, and felt the weight of what came next, settling heavy across her shoulders. No, she agreed quietly, it's not. She thought of the ledger, still safely tucked in her satchel, of the names and dates, and forged documents that could bring Thorne's entire operation crashing down if they ever reached the right hands. She thought, too, of her father's old journals, of the settlement she'd read about, tucked deeper into the hill country, one that might offer more than just temporary shelter. Whatever came next, she understood now, wouldn't be about running or hiding any longer. It would be about building something strong enough that men like Thorne could no longer tear it down. Wyatt slept for the better part of 2 days, waking only in short stretches to drink water, or take a little broth before drifting under again. Clara barely left his side, catching her own rest in short bursts on a mat laid next to his, waking at every shift in his breathing, every low sound of pain that escaped him in his sleep. On the 3rd morning, he woke clear-eyed and steady. Color returned to his face, and the first thing he did was reach for his shoulder, testing the range of motion with a wince. Easy, Clara said, catching his hand before he could pull the bandage loose. Nasha said no sudden movement for at least another week. Nasha also said I'd live. Figured that meant I could move my own arm. It means you're alive. Not that you're foolish enough to undo a week of healing in one careless motion. She adjusted the bandage where he'd disturbed it. You lost a lot of blood. Wyatt, give yourself time. He looked at her a long moment. Something soft in his expression, despite the discomfort still evident on his face. You've been here the whole time, he said. Haven't you? Where else would I be? Could have been resting. Could have been doing something more useful than watching me sleep. I was doing something useful. I was making sure you kept breathing. She said it lighter than she felt, though the fear of those first hours still sat heavy in her memory. The moment she'd seen him drop into the mud along the riverbank, blood soaking through his shirt. Wyatt reached for her hand, his grip weaker than it had been before the injury, but no less certain in its intent. Thank you, he said, for getting me here, for fighting off those men when I couldn't. You'd have done the same for me. Already did. Twice now, since the day I rode into your yard. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Figured it was your turn. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at that, though the moment was interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside the shelter. She rose and pulled back the flap to see a gathering forming near the center of the settlement. More people than she'd seen in one place since their arrival, faces drawn tight with worry and anger both. What's happening? She asked Nasha, who stood near the edge of the crowd. Words traveled fast. 2 more families arrived this morning, run off their land by Thorne's men while you were recovering here. A Comanche family from the North Pasture, and the Delgados. Ranchers who've worked that valley 3 generations. Nasha's face was grim. Thorne's getting bolder. Figures if he can't find you quick enough, he'll take everything else in the meantime. Clara felt something harden in her resolve at that news. She'd spent 2 years documenting exactly this kind of theft in secret, believing the proof alone would someday be enough. But watching families arrive at the settlement with nothing but what they could carry, watching children clutch what few belongings they'd managed to save. She understood that proof without action was just ink on paper. She returned to the shelter and gathered up the ledger from her satchel, then went back outside to find Wyatt had managed to pull himself upright despite her earlier instructions, leaning heavily against the shelter's support post. You should be resting, she said. Can't rest through this. Not with more families losing everything while I lie around healing. He nodded toward the gathering crowd. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time people knew exactly what Thorne's been doing, and exactly how he's been doing it. She held up the ledger. I'm thinking it's time I stopped keeping this hidden and started using it. Wyatt studied her. Something like pride mixing with concern in his expression. You're talking about standing up in front of that whole crowd. I'm talking about exactly that. Clara? Some of these families have lost everything to men like Thorn. Grief and anger like that. It doesn't always listen to reason, even when reason's exactly what's needed. Then I'll have to make them listen. She met his eyes steady. I've spent 2 years being quiet, being careful, waiting for someone else to fix what's broken. I'm done waiting, Wyatt, if not now, when everyone's angry and everyone's ready to hear it. Then when? He held her gaze a long moment and finally nodded, understanding the truth of it, even if concern still lined his face. Then I'll be right here, he said, watching your back, same as you watched mine. Clara walked toward the gathering, with the ledger clutched against her chest, her heart hammering but her steps steady. Nasha noticed her approach and raised a hand, quieting the murmur of the crowd enough for Clara to be heard. My name is Clara Hayes, she began, her voice carrying farther than she expected, across the gathered families. Some of you know my father's name. He traded fair with your people for years before he died, before Silas Thorne and my own stepmother conspired to steal his ranch out from under him using forged paper and false debt. A murmur ran through the crowd at that, recognition in some faces, sympathy in others. I know some of you have lost far more than land, Clara continued. Some of you have lost family. Lost generations of history tied to ground that Thorne's lawyers have twisted into paper he can wave around and call legal. I understand that pain, because I've lived beside it for 2 years. Watching my own father's murder get dismissed as an accident. Watching everything he built get carved up and handed to a man who never once earned it, honestly. She opened the ledger, holding it up so the crowd could see the pages filled with careful handwriting. This is 2 years of proof. Forged deeds, falsified debts, corrupt officials who signed documents while they were 100 miles away from where their signature claims they stood. Every name, every date. Thorns committed against this valley, written down and ready to be used. Proof doesn't put food on the table. A voice called from the crowd, an older rancher whose weathered face carried the particular exhaustion of a man who'd lost everything more than once in his life. Proof doesn't give us back what he's already taken. No, Clara agreed, it doesn't. Not on its own. But proof, put in front of a federal judge instead of a county one bought and paid for by Thorne's money. That's the difference between him walking free to do this again and him standing trial for every family he's ruined. She looked around at the gathered faces, tribal and rancher alike, all of them bound together now by the same grievance. I'm not asking any of you to fight with guns, though I know some of you have already lost enough to want exactly that. I'm asking you to stand together long enough to make sure this proof reaches somewhere Thorne can't buy his way out of. Silence stretched across the gathering, broken only by the low sound of wind through the settlement and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Then Nasha stepped forward, standing beside Clara, her weathered face set with quiet determination. I've watched this girl's father deal honest with my people for years, back when honest dealing was rare enough to remember clearly, she said. I've watched her ride into this settlement injured and afraid, and I've watched her stay steady enough these past days to nurse a wounded man back to health, while carrying proof enough to bring down the man who wounded him. I believe what she says, and I believe standing together is the only chance any of us have against a man with Thorne's money and Thorne's reach. One by one, others stepped forward, voices rising in agreement. Families who'd lost everything finding common cause in the shared injustice laid bare in Clara's ledger. It wasn't unanimous, not entirely. Some faces still carrying doubt or exhaustion too deep to hope again. But enough voices rose in support that Clara felt something shift in the gathering, a coalition forming from scattered grief and shared purpose. She looked back toward the shelter where Wyatt stood watching, pale from his injury, but steady on his feet, and found him looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful respect of their early days together, nor even the warmth that had grown between them since. Something deeper, something that looked, in the honest light of that afternoon, very much like love. You did that, he said quietly, once she'd made her way back to him after the crowd had begun to disperse. already talking among themselves about what came next. Convinced a settlement people who've got every reason to distrust outsiders to stand together against the man who's hurt them. I didn't do it alone. You taught me plenty of what I needed to survive long enough to have this chance. I taught you to shoot a gun straight. Everything you just did up there. That was all you. He reached for her hand despite his injury, lacing his fingers through hers. I've served alongside rangers who couldn't have rallied a room like that, watching you do it just now. I understood something I hadn't quite let myself admit before. What's that? That I'm not just fighting alongside you because I owe some debt to my sister's memory, or because it happened to be the right thing to do. The day I rode into your yard. His eyes held hers, steady and certain. I'm fighting alongside you because somewhere between that first day and now, I fell in love with you, Clara Hayes. The words landed soft but certain in the space between them, and Clara felt something in her chest bloom warm, despite the exhaustion and fear of the past week. I love you too, she said, surprised at how easily the words came, how true they felt, after everything they'd survived together. I think I have for longer than I've let myself admit. Wyatt leaned down, careful of his injured shoulder, and kissed her there in the fading afternoon light, gentle and unhurried, despite everything urgent still ahead of them. It felt like a promise more than a celebration, a vow made quiet between two people who understood exactly what the road ahead still demanded of them. We've got a coalition now, Clara said when they finally parted. Families willing to stand together. But we still need to get this ledger somewhere safe, somewhere it can actually be used against Thorne. There's a federal marshal, name of Coleman, works out of the territorial courthouse, 2 days' ride from here. Man's got a reputation for being incorruptible, which in this territory is rare enough to be worth trusting. Wyatt's expression turned thoughtful. If we can get the ledger into his hands directly, along with enough witnesses willing to testify, we might actually see Thorne answer for what he's done. Then that's our next move. Clara looked back toward the settlement, at families already beginning to organize, at children playing near cook fires despite everything they'd lost, at the quiet resilience of people who refuse to be broken, even by repeated tragedy. But first, you need at least another week to heal properly. Marshal Coleman isn't going anywhere, and I won't risk your life again by rushing this before you're ready. Bossy, Wyatt said again. The warmth colored the word rather than complaint. Practical, Clara corrected. There's a difference. Reckon there is. He squeezed her hand gently. All right, 1 week. Then we ride for Coleman's courthouse and bring this whole rotten operation crashing down. They stood together, watching the settlement continue its work around them. Coalition building slow but steady among families who'd found unexpected common ground in shared injustice. Clara thought of her father, of the 2 years of quiet documentation that had led to this exact moment, and felt something like peace settle over the fear that had gripped her for so long. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she believed with certainty that it could actually be won. The week passed faster than Clara expected, Wyatt's strength returning steadily under Nash's careful treatment. The coalition of displaced families growing as word spread further through the territory about the proof Clara carried and the fight building against Thorne's operation. On the morning, they planned to leave for Marshal Coleman's courthouse. A rider arrived at the settlement at a dead run, his horse lathered and exhausted, his face pale with urgency. Fire, he gasped, barely managing to stay upright in his saddle. Thorne's men set fire to the Hayes ranch, whole place is burning. Clara's stomach dropped. Why would he burn it? There's nothing left there worth taking. Word is, he's trying to draw you out, the rider said. Figures, if he burns everything connected to your family. You'll come running, and he can finish what he started before that ledger ever reaches a judge. Wyatt was already moving toward the horses, his shoulder healed enough now to bear the strain of hard riding, though Clara noted the careful way he still favored it. He's desperate, Wyatt said, checking his rifle with quick, efficient movements. Desperate men make mistakes. This is his last play before Coleman gets involved, and he knows it. We can't just ride into a trap. Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood. There was no version of this, where she simply let her father's ranch burn without response. It's exactly what he wants. Then we don't ride in blind. Wyatt turned to her, already calculating. We bring the coalition. Every family willing to stand with us. Every rifle willing to be raised in defense of something worth protecting. Thorne's expecting you to come running alone, desperate and afraid. He's not expecting an army. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and within the hour, a formation had gathered that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. Comanche riders alongside displaced ranchers. Families who'd lost everything to Thorne's operation, now bound together by shared purpose, and Clara's careful proof of the crimes committed against them all. Nasha herself rode at the front alongside Clara and Wyatt, her weathered face set with quiet determination. "This isn't just your fight anymore," she said as they rode. "Thorne's made it everyone's fight. Every time he's forged a deed or burned a home to cover his tracks. Today we answer together." They reached the Hayes Ranch as afternoon shadows stretched long across the scorched earth, smoke already rising thick and black against the darkening sky. The main house had caught fully, flames consuming what remained of Clara's childhood home. The barn nearby already reduced to smoldering timber. Silas Thorne stood in the courtyard, flanked by a dozen armed men, his face lit orange by the flames behind him, an expression of fury and desperation twisting his usually composed features. "You actually came," he called out as their coalition rode into view, disbelief evident in his voice as he took in the size of the force arrayed against him. "Brought half the territory with you. It looks like you burned my father's home," Clara called back, her voice steady, despite the fear still coiled tight in her stomach. "You've taken everything else you could steal from this valley. I figured it was time someone showed you exactly what happens when good people finally stand together against you." "This changes nothing," Thorne said, though uncertainty had crept into his voice now, his eyes darting across the assembled riders. "That ledger of yours is just paper. Paper burns just as easy as any house. This ledger isn't the only copy anymore." Clara reached into her satchel and pulled free a second bound volume, one she and Wyatt had spent the past week carefully transcribing by lamplight. "I've made copies, Thorne. Multiple copies. Distributed among people you can't reach and can't silence." Movement caught Clara's eye at the edge of the property, and she recognized the approach of a rider wearing a federal marshal's badge, flanked by two deputies, clearly drawn by the smoke visible for miles across the flat terrain. "Marshal Coleman," Wyatt said quietly beside her, recognition and relief evident in his voice. "Sooner than we hoped. But exactly when we need him." Coleman reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the gathered coalition, taking in the burning ranch house, the armed men flanking Thorne, and the assembled families arrayed against him. With the careful assessment of a man used to reading dangerous situations quickly. "Somebody want to explain why half this territory looks ready to start a war in my jurisdiction?" Coleman asked, his voice carrying easy authority, despite the tension thick in the air. Clara rode forward, holding up the original ledger along with the copy she'd just shown Thorne. "Marshal Coleman, my name is Clara Hayes. This ledger documents 2 years of land fraud committed by Silas Thorne, including forged deeds, falsified debts, and corrupt officials paid to look the other way. He's just set fire to my family's ranch, trying to destroy evidence and draw me into a trap." Coleman's expression sharpened as he took the offered ledger, flipping through pages with the quick, assessing eyes of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. "This is thorough," he said after a long moment. "Names, dates, filed documents cross-referenced against public record discrepancies." His eyes moved to Thorne, cold and calculating now. "Elias Cobb's name appears here more than a few times." "Cobb's my lawyer," Thorne said quickly. "Nothing illegal about legal representation." "Nothing illegal about legal representation?" "No. Something very illegal about forging witness signatures on land filings, though, which is exactly what this ledger documents in detail." Coleman's gaze swept across the assembled coalition, then back to Thorne. I think you and I have considerable business to discuss, Mr. Thorne, and I don't believe any of it's going to end well for you. Thorne's composure finally cracked, desperation flooding his features as he realized the trap he'd hoped to spring had instead closed around himself. This is absurd, he said, backing toward his men. You'd take the word of a hysterical girl and a pile of savages and drifters over a respected businessman. I'd take documented evidence over unfounded accusations any day of the week, Coleman said flatly, and I'd remind you that threatening federal proceedings with armed men rarely goes well for the man doing the threatening. Thorne's hand moved toward his sidearm, panic overriding whatever calculation remained in his desperate mind. But Wyatt was faster, his own weapon already drawn and leveled, before Thorne's fingers even closed around his pistol grip. Don't, Wyatt said, voice flat and final. You've done enough today. You're a dead man. Sterling. Thorne spat, though his hand had frozen halfway to his weapon. You and this whole worthless coalition you've dragged together. Maybe, Wyatt said, but you'll be dead first if you finish that draw. The standoff stretched tense and brittle, flames still crackling behind Thorne as his men shifted uncertainly, clearly weighing loyalty to a man whose empire was visibly crumbling against the very real threat of federal marshals and a coalition of armed families ready to answer violence with violence. Then Thorne drew. The shot came fast, but Wyatt was faster, his own bullet catching the pistol clean out of Thorne's grip before the man's finger even found the trigger. Thorne cried out, clutching his injured hand, sinking to his knees in the dirt as his own weapon skittered away into the scorched grass. Wyatt advanced, rifle still leveled, his face carved from something cold and final. Clara watched him approach the kneeling man, watched old grief and fresh fury war visibly across his scarred features, and understood in that moment exactly how close Wyatt stood to crossing a line that would haunt him the rest of his days. Wyatt, she called, riding forward quickly. Wyatt, look at me. He didn't lower the rifle, his eyes still locked on Thorne's kneeling form, the man responsible not just for Clara's suffering, but for the echo of his sister's death years before. He deserves this, Wyatt said, voice rough with barely controlled emotion. After everything he's done, everyone he's hurt. Maybe he does, Clara said, dismounting and moving to stand beside him, her hand resting gentle on his arm. But that's not your decision to make today. Not like this. Sarah didn't get justice. Nobody stopped Callahan before he destroyed her. And I've spent 2 years telling myself that if I ever had the chance to stop a man like him, I wouldn't hesitate. You already stopped him. Wyatt, look around you. Clara gestured toward the coalition, still gathered. Toward Marshal Coleman, watching the standoff with careful attention. Toward the ledger, still clutched in her other hand. This is what stopping him actually looks like. Not one bullet in the dirt. Real justice. The kind that holds and doesn't just satisfy anger for a moment before fading. Wyatt's hand trembled slightly on the rifle. Old grief and present fury still warring visibly behind his eyes. He doesn't get to make you a murderer, Clara said softly. Not after everything else he's already taken. Don't let him take this from you, too. Slowly, the tension eased from Wyatt's shoulders, and he lowered the rifle, though his eyes never left Thorne's kneeling form. Marshal Coleman, Wyatt said, voice steadier now. I believe this man's under arrest. Coleman moved forward, his deputies falling in alongside him, and within minutes, Thorne had been bound and secured, his remaining men disarmed without further resistance. The fight, clearly gone from all of them, once their leader's empire had visibly collapsed. This ledger, Coleman said, addressing Clara directly, along with witness testimony from everyone gathered here today. That's more than enough to see Thorne answer in federal court. Might take time, given his connections. But evidence this thorough doesn't disappear easy, not once it's properly filed. Thank you, Marshal, Clara said, relief and exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. For coming when you did. Smoke's visible for miles in flat country like this. Didn't take much figuring to understand something serious was happening. Coleman studied her a moment, something like respect in his weathered expression. 2 years of documentation like this, Miss Hayes. That's not easy work for anyone, let alone someone in your position. Territory owes you a debt for the courage it took. As Coleman's deputies led Thorne away toward waiting horses, Clara turned to look at the burning remains of her childhood home. Flames finally beginning to die down as the fire consumed what fuel remained. Grief mixed with something like release as she watched years of pain and fear finally reaching some kind of resolution. Wyatt came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers in the fading light. "It's over," he said quietly. "The fighting's over," Clara agreed, "but there's still plenty of rebuilding ahead." "Then we rebuild," Wyatt said. Together, this time, she looked up at him, at the man who'd ridden into her life at exactly the moment she'd needed him most, who'd chosen justice over vengeance, even when vengeance had felt entirely earned, and felt something like hope bloom steady in her chest, despite the smoke and ash still settling around them. Together, she echoed. 6 months passed, and the Hayes Ranch transformed slowly from ash and ruin into something new entirely. Silas Thorne sat now in federal prison, his trial swift once Clara's ledger, and the testimony of dozens of affected families had been properly presented before a judge well outside the reach of his former influence. Elias Cobb faced his own charges alongside him, disbarred and awaiting sentencing for the fraud that had touched so many families across the territory. Beatrice had fled before federal marshals could arrest her, though word eventually reached Clara that her stepmother had been spotted in a distant territory, stripped of the wealth she'd once flaunted so carelessly, reduced to circumstances considerably less comfortable than the life she'd schemed and murdered to maintain. Clara had rebuilt the ranch house herself, with considerable help from the coalition of families who'd stood beside her that day at the burning ranch. But she hadn't rebuilt it as it once was, a single family's private holding. Instead, she'd transformed it into something the valley had never seen before, a cooperative shared among the ranchers and tribal families Thorne had once tried to destroy. Water and land resources divided fair and equal among everyone willing to work the ground together. She stood now at the edge of the newly built barn, watching Comanche riders work alongside displaced ranchers, tending cattle that belonged not to any single family, but to the cooperative as a whole, an experiment in shared prosperity that had, against considerable odds, begun to flourish. Educational value's been the whole point, Nasha had told her once, watching the cooperative take shape, showing this valley that shared resources build more than any single man's greed ever could. Clara had taken that lesson to heart, expanding the cooperative model further each month, teaching children from both communities to read and write alongside practical ranching skills, building something that felt less like recovery from tragedy and more like genuine transformation. She was reviewing the cooperative's ledgers, an entirely different kind of record-keeping than the one that had once documented Thorne's crimes, when she noticed Wyatt across the yard, saddlebags slung over his shoulder, his black roan already saddled and waiting near the gate. Her stomach dropped at the sight. She crossed the yard quickly, catching up to him just as he finished tightening the cinch on his saddle. "Where are you going?" she asked, though something in her voice already anticipated an answer she didn't want to hear. Wyatt turned to face her, and something uncertain flickered across his features, a rare vulnerability from a man who'd faced down armed bounty hunters without flinching. "Figured it was time I moved on," he said. "This place is thriving now. Clara, you've built something real here, something that doesn't need a drifter with my kind of past hanging around, reminding everyone of the violence it took to get here. That's not your decision to make alone. I've spent my whole life either running toward violence or running from grief," Wyatt continued, as though she hadn't spoken. "Don't know how to build something peaceful, not the way you've built this. Figured you deserved better than watching me try and fail at something I've got no experience doing." Clara stepped forward, planting herself directly between Wyatt and the open gate beyond him, her arms crossed and her expression set with the same quiet determination that had once rallied an entire settlement to her cause. "I didn't ask for a knight to save me and ride off into some sunset," she said. "I'm asking for a partner to help me run this valley. Someone who understands exactly what it cost to build this, because he bled for it right alongside me. Clara, you taught me to shoot straight when I had nothing but fear and a ledger to protect myself with," she continued, refusing to let him interrupt. "You showed me that enduring pain isn't the same as fighting back against it. You gave up vengeance for justice, even when vengeance would have felt easier and more satisfying in the moment. That's not the resume of a man who doesn't know how to build something peaceful. Wyatt, that's exactly the foundation peace requires." Wyatt studied her a long moment, saddlebags still slung heavy over his shoulder, his black roan shifting restlessly behind him. "Do you have the grit to stay?" Clara asked finally, holding out a set of keys toward him, the same keys that unlocked the newly rebuilt main house behind her. "Because I've got more work ahead than I can manage alone, and I'd rather build it with you beside me than watch you ride away from something we both fought too hard to create." For a long moment, Wyatt didn't move. Old habits of solitude and self-doubt visibly warring against something warmer, something that had been building steady between them since the night she'd first brought him a plate of stew beneath a moonlit sky. Then he dropped his saddlebags into the dirt. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 long strides. And before Clara could say anything further, his arms came around her, pulling her close, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that carried all the certainty his earlier hesitation had lacked. It was deep and unhurried, a kiss that spoke of everything they'd survived together and everything still ahead of them. 6 months of careful rebuilding, finally crystallizing into a promise neither of them intended to break. When they finally parted, Clara found herself laughing, breathless and joyful, in a way she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. "I'll take that as a yes," she said. "Reckon you should." Wyatt's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing gentle across her cheek, the same cheek Silas Thorne had once struck in cruelty. "I love you, Clara Hayes. Took me longer than it should have to understand that loving you also meant staying, not just fighting." "I love you, too," Clara said. "And for what it's worth, staying takes considerably more courage than riding away ever did. Running from something hard is easy. Building something worth keeping, that's the real fight. Then I reckon we've got plenty of fighting still ahead of us. The good kind, this time." Wyatt smiled at that, genuine and unguarded in a way Clara had rarely seen from him. And together they turned to look out across the ranch, at the cooperative slowly transforming grief and injustice into something worth protecting. Comanche children ran laughing between newly planted rows of crops. Ranchers who'd once competed bitterly for scarce water now worked side by side, sharing resources that had once been hoarded and weaponized against them. The Hayes Ranch, once a symbol of theft and cruelty, had become instead a testament to what shared purpose and hard-won justice could build from the ashes of tragedy. The morning sun climbed steady over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. The kind of Texas sunrise that had witnessed both tremendous cruelty and remarkable resilience across generations of struggle in this unforgiving land. Clara leaned into Wyatt's side, his arm settling comfortable around her shoulders, and watched the valley she'd fought so hard to reclaim finally begin. "In earnest to heal partners," she said again, echoing the vow they'd first made in a canyon shelter during a howling storm months before. "Partners," Wyatt agreed, "for however many sunrises we've got ahead of us." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, casting long golden light across the valley below. Two people who'd found in each other not rescue or dependency, but genuine partnership forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. Behind them, the cooperative continued its steady work. Families who'd once stood divided by circumstance, now bound together by shared purpose and the hard-won understanding that justice, properly pursued, could transform even the deepest wounds into lasting strength. The frontier stretched wide and golden before them, full of uncertainty still, but faced now with a partnership strong enough to meet whatever challenges remained ahead. So that's where we leave Clara and Wyatt, standing shoulder to shoulder in the golden light, looking out over a valley that almost destroyed them both. But before you go, I want to sit with this story a little longer, because underneath all the gunfire and the storms and the slow burn romance, there's something real here, something worth carrying with you past the credits. Let's start with Clara. For 2 years she endured. She took the blows. She swallowed the insults. She watched her inheritance get stripped away piece by piece, and she did it quietly. Not because she was weak, because she understood something a lot of people never learn until it's too late. Survival and surrender are not the same thing. Remember what Wyatt told her that first night by the fire. Endurance keeps you breathing. Accepting the whip makes you the one holding it. That line isn't just a piece of Western dialogue. That's a warning about what happens when we mistake patience for powerlessness. Clara never stopped being patient, but she also never stopped building. Every night she snuck into that study. Every entry she wrote into that ledger. She was doing something most people in her position never do. She was documenting her own injustice instead of just absorbing it. She turned herself from a victim into a witness. And that difference, that single choice to keep records instead of just keeping her head down, that's what saved her in the end. Not a rescue, not luck, preparation. That's the first lesson this story hands us. If you're in a hard season right now, if somebody's got their boot on your neck, whether it's a person or a circumstance or a system that feels rigged against you, don't just survive it. Pay attention to it. Write it down. Learn its patterns. Because someday, you're going to need that knowledge. And the people who prepared quietly in the dark are always the ones who walk into the light ready. Now let's talk about Wyatt. Here's a man carrying guilt heavy enough to bury most people. He couldn't save his sister. He watched a land baron destroy his family the same way Thorne destroyed Clara's. And he told himself for years that arriving too late made him responsible for everything that came after. That kind of grief doesn't just disappear. It follows a man. It scars him, literally and otherwise. But notice what Wyatt does with that pain. He doesn't let it turn him into Thorne. He doesn't let it turn him into a man who takes what he wants because the world already took something from him. Instead, he channels it. He becomes the man who stops for the woman on the side of the road instead of riding past her the way he once rode past his sister's suffering. And here's the moment that really matters. Standing over Thorne in that burning courtyard, rifle raised, every instinct screaming for vengeance, Wyatt has the chance to become exactly the kind of man his grief always told him to be. Cold. Final. Judge, jury, and executioner all in one trigger pull. And he doesn't take it. Because Clara reminds him of something crucial. Justice and vengeance might look the same from a distance, but they are not the same thing. Vengeance ends with a body in the dirt and a man who has to live with what he's become. Justice ends with a system that actually holds, one that protects the next family and the one after that, instead of just satisfying one man's anger for a single fleeting moment. That's the second lesson. Real strength isn't the willingness to pull the trigger. It's the discipline to lower the gun when everything in you wants to fire. Thank you for riding along with us through this one. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something in your chest during that storm or that courtyard or that final sunrise, let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about resilience, about justice, about love built on equal ground instead of rescue, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we've got plenty more frontier waiting for you. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.